All right, there we go. Okay. Hory, all yours.
All right. Sorry. So again, my name is Hory Chikez, and thank you for your time here today, both to you guys here, but also from our online audience. Today, I'm going to present to you a summary of my PhD research titled Decision Support Tools to Guide Assessment and Promotion of Post-Harvest Technologies to Ensure Food Security. So studies have shown that there are science-based technologies that exist to help value chains reduce food loss and therefore become more food secure. However, the adoption of those post-harvest technology remains very low, especially in places like Sub-Saharan Africa, which remains one of the most food insecure regions of the world. So with that, the question I had is, how do we best promote technologies to increase their adoptions? That's really the research question here. And I looked at 2 case studies to answer that question. The first one is based sort of in the low-income countries, as you can see on the left-hand side of this slide. And this was a project that was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. It's called the YieldWise Initiative, which took place in 3 countries, 3 food value chains: mango in Kenya, maize in Tanzania, and tomato in Nigeria. Then there is another case study that I looked at on the right-hand side of this slide. This is more of a high-income country scenario. Here I'm looking at a project funded by the Walmart Foundation and primarily focusing on helping farmers, sweet potato farmers in North Carolina. And so I will talk a little bit more in details later in this presentation about these 2 projects. And so the first thing I did before answering the question of, how do we best promote technologies for adoption, I first wanted to know who are the people responsible for promoting adoption in each of these case studies. It turns out that within the YieldWise Initiative, the program managers, they had program managers in all 3 countries, and these are the guys that were responsible to promote the technologies for adoption. And in the case of the sweet potato value chain in North Carolina, they had extension experts who would go to the growers and advise them on technologies that should be used to reduce loss. And so with this information, the goal of this research was to create 2 decision support tools. One, to help program managers assess technologies and then promote them. And 2, help extension experts to also assess technologies and promote them to the growers. Decision support tool is typically just an information system that is used to support decision-making in a program or an organization and so on. And typically there are 4 components of a decision support tool, as you can see here on this picture on the right-hand side. I'm gonna start with the last one that you see over here. That's the user. And the user is really what we've just established by looking at who is responsible for promoting technologies in each of those value chains I talked about earlier on. And then there are other components that I will talk about later in this presentation. So it's important to kind of keep these components because I will be referring back to them later in the presentation. And we also came up with 4 objectives to attain the goal that I just mentioned earlier. There were 3 objectives that are related to the decision support tool in the low income countries. And the 4th objective is related to the decision support tool in the high income country scenario. And so that's what I'm going to focus on. Starting with the low income country scenario, I'm not gonna, unfortunately, we don't have enough time for me to go through all the 3 objectives. So I'm quickly gonna give you a background on the Rockefeller Foundation, what it was about. Then I will quickly touch on some key learnings from objective 1 and objective 2. And then I'm gonna focus a little bit more on objective 3 because that's where we build the decision support tool. And that's what I want us to look at more. So the YieldWise initiative was launched in 2016 in 3, as I mentioned earlier, in 3 countries, Nigeria, Kenya, and Tanzania, looking at different crops. And the objective was to help smallholder farmers reduce food loss after harvest by providing a number of interventions to them, such as technologies and trainings and so on. And as a result of that, the Rockefeller Foundation, in partnership with some implementing partners, collected some data, first before the initiative as a baseline survey, and then after the initiative as an end-light survey. And that resulted into a massive amount of data, massive amount of data connected to post-harvest loss and technology adoption as well. So that data was made available to us here at Iowa State. So the first thing I did when I received the data was to just analyze the data, and that's my first objective, and summarize all of that data in terms of post-harvest loss and technology adoptions. Two key learnings here. One, in terms of what actually works. Well, what worked was there are some technologies that were promoted within the initiative that actually were associated with reduction in post-harvest loss. But then there are some shortcomings as well. The first one, those technologies that were good at reducing post-harvest loss were not very much adopted by the farmers, only very few of them. The second shortcoming was that the post-harvest loss reduction was the only criterion used by the program managers to promote the technologies within the YieldWise initiative. And later on, we will see why using only one criterion is actually a bit of a shortcoming. The last shortcoming was the fact that the YieldWise initiative focused on addressing the needs of the smallholder farmers alone. We know that most value chain are made up of interconnected value chain actors. So looking at just the smallholder farmers is probably not a good way to promote adoption. And some deliverables from this objective, we had one article that was published in June of 2021. And I also created a web-based dashboard, which really just summarized the post-harvest loss data as a function of a number of variables, which can be accessed through the URL that I have over here on the slide. The second objective was really just try to understand a little bit more that YieldWise data, but this time identifying some critical drivers of post-harvest loss. And some key learning from there was that, well, the critical drivers of post-harvest loss are, what are called passive and active. So the passive drivers are those that are difficult to change, such as geographic locations, socioeconomic background of the farmers, education level, and so on. And the active drivers are the ones that are changeable, such as a choice of a technology over another or an agricultural practice. And within those active variables, what we learned from using a predictive model was that increasing the adoption of those technologies actually does have an impact on post-harvest loss. And why is this important in terms of building the decision support tool? Well, if increasing the adoption of post-harvest loss does have an impact on reducing post-harvest loss, and promoting technologies effectively can help increase the adoption, then promoting technologies can definitely help reduce post-harvest loss. So as a deliverable, we have one completed manuscript in this objective, which hopefully will be submitted by the end of this month for publication. And I also added a predictive model functionality to the dashboard I built before so that the user can actually try and increase adoption and see how it affects post-harvest loss, increasing the number of farmers. The third objective, and this is really what I want to focus on because the previous two objectives kind of culminates to this one, the decision support tool using a multi-attribute utility theory. And the goal of this decision support tool is first to assess and rank technologies based on multiple criteria, not just post-harvest loss, but multiple criteria. We want the decision support tool to heed or include the perspective of various value chain actors and not just the farmers, but also it's designed for the agricultural program managers to be used in those low-income countries I mentioned earlier. So first of all, I identified some adoption measures in addition to post-harvest loss, and I used sustainability to guide me so that I could have a holistic approach to identifying the criteria. So what we have here, we have post-harvest loss as within the environmental criteria, then we have 3 economic criteria and 2 social ones. What we could also see on this slide is that 4 of the 6 criteria are numerical, so they can be defined by numerical value, and the last 2 are categorical, they are more discrete. So these were the criteria. And then what we did after this was collect some data, because as I mentioned earlier, with the decision support tool, we have the interface, but we first need to collect some data and then have a system software which does all the calculations. And so the data that we collected, I worked very much with some in-field, in-country specialists that were part of the YieldWise initiative. And in 3 countries, Kenya, Tanzania, and Nigeria. And we also trained some enumerators, the people who were collecting the data, using as part of the IRB approval process, just to make sure that they know about the privacy of the people, how to protect the privacy of the people they were interviewing. And so what's really important is we interviewed 600 individuals in these 3 countries. And these individuals were categorized by value chain actors categories we have here. So we had 4 categories: technology suppliers, smallholder farmers, crop buyers, and policymakers. And so these are the people that were interviewed to get essentially 3 types of data. The first type of data, but before we talk about the type of data we collected from these individuals, I just want to quickly talk about this multi-attribute utility theory approach. So what we're actually doing essentially is calculate a composite utility value. And the composite utility value is calculated by, for each of these technologies that we see here. We have a number of technologies that were identified within each value chain. And so they're calculated for each technology based on the weighted sum of these measures that we have over here. So it was important to first come up with a weight so that we could have a weighted sum for each of these technologies. But what was also important is, as you can see, these measures all have different units. So post-harvest loss is a unit of percentage of weight that is discarded due to apparent damage. And then we have the price, we have the lifespan, which is duration, and so on. So the second type of data we had to collect was actually data that would allow us to convert these measures from a natural unit, such as percentage, price, to an abstract equivalent that ranges from 0 to 1. And that's really what the utility is. And to do that, we had to find out what is the performance for each technology, because if we're going to aggregate these measures, we first need to know what is the measure for each one of them. So for example, if I take PICS bags there, and I need to determine, what is the post-harvest loss typically of a PICS bag over a year, and so on. Once I determine that, then I have to go to I have to normalize this value, and I normalize it by using a formula for the utility that I have here. And so I would take the actual value that I have for the PICS bag. So for example, if a PICS bag, I'm gonna go with purchasing price. If a PICS bag costs $2, right, as a purchasing price, and based on demand and availability, that price could vary from say $1.8 to $4. Now, the worst value will be, if I'm speaking to a technology supplier, then they could say that, a PICS bag that costs a very high price of $4, that might be a good value to them because they might be making a lot of profit on that. But to a smallholder farmers, the worst value might be a value that is too high because they cannot afford it. So the utility will really vary depending on, from one value chain actor to another. So the first thing I had to do was to establish what are the worst and the best values for each of these measures that we have over here. And that will vary based on one value chain actor to another. And also the weight will also vary from one value chain actor to another because, for example, to a smallholder farmer, the purchasing price might be an important measure, but to a policymaker, perhaps post-harvest loss might be more important. So the utility value will vary both based on the weight and also the preference of the value chain actors. So once we convert those measures into a utility value, we can then multiply them by the weight to obtain that weighted sum, which is the composite utility value. And so with that, what I did was managed to collect the data. I do all the calculation using the R-Shiny package of R. And this is what the user interface looks like. So this is going to the third part of the decision support tool, which uses the user interface. And here, what's the user, ideally the program manager will be able to do is pick a value chain. We have 3 of them there. And then they can select what technologies they want to compare. Once they've done that, they could then look at the measures, which these data were already collected from the survey. And then once they've collected the data, the question is, how do we combine all of these into a single value for each technology there? And those is by using the formula that I just mentioned earlier. And by doing that, the user can just click on the results tab over there, which will then combine all of these measures into a utility. But before I get to that, I forgot to mention that here in the decision support tool, there are predefined technologies. As you can see here, I have fixed bags and polypropylene bag, but the user is also able to define their own technologies. So that's also important. But let's continue with the two examples I mentioned earlier. So once I say view the result, then I get these graph over here, which shows me that, well, the fixed bag has a higher composite utility than the polypropylene bag, almost double. And within that, I can also see the account of each of the measures. But that's only if I'm looking at the technology suppliers. I have 4 value chain actors. If I change from the technology supplier to the smallholder farmers and to the next value chain actor and so on, and the fixed bags is consistently the one technology that has the highest utility, then it means that the fixed bag can maximize the preference of all the value chain actors, which will be a good basis to promote this technology. So this is pretty much the same picture I showed earlier on, but I'm showing a more comprehensive image of it, looking at all the value chain actors, not just the technology suppliers. So essentially what we can see here is, as I was, just what I just mentioned earlier, that to the policymakers, the fixed bag does have a high utility, and it's the highest across all value chain actors. So that really tells us that it maximizes the performance of all the value chain actors in comparison to the polypropylene bags. And so in conclusion, what I can say about this objective 3 is that the composite utility is quite a reliable way of assessing technologies because it doesn't only look at one criterion, it looks at multiple criteria. The preferred adoption measures and weight can vary. There's something that I did not get too much in detail. We looked at the maize value chain, but in the other value chains, sometimes not all the value chain actors have the same preferences, which can make the ranking a little bit difficult. And so the example we looked at was Tanzania, where I compared the fixed bags to the polypropylene bags, but the user could also compare, mango in Kenya, tomato in Nigeria, or other value chains that might be interested in. So that's what it is. And so as a deliverable, we have one completed manuscript on this objective. And also I have this web-based decision support tool, which can be accessed from any device, a cell phone or a computer with a good internet connection so that the user can make those type of analyses I just showed earlier. And now moving into the second part of the second case study, which is the one that is related to objective 4. In this case study, it was a case study that was funded by the Walmart Foundation. And just as a quick background, the idea was to use innovative image-based technologies to prevent post-harvest loss of sweet potatoes. And this was a project where there's a number of institutions that got involved. We have the Consortium for Innovation in Post-Harvest Loss with Waste Reduction. We have Geovisual Analytics, which is the company that's provided the drone to be used for the image to be captured. We have a consulting firm in North Carolina, which worked hand in hand with the growers to collect the data and provide that to us. And so with that, really, we also have some professor here, Dr. Lee Tang in the department, working with one of his Ph.D. students, Adi, in terms of using the collected data and running them through some deep learning models to quantify the sweet potatoes left in the field. And so I think before getting into the techno-economic analysis side of these objectives, I just want to quickly give a background of what the sweet potato harvesting process is like. and what are the alternatives or the scenarios used for the techno-economic analysis. So from the growers' interviews that were shared with us through one of through the consulting firm that was also part of this project, from the interviews that they had with the growers in North Carolina, what we've learned is that the sweet potato growing process starts by preparing some sweet potato slips. We can't really see that first block there, but these are really just the seedlings that are used to plant and grow the sweet potatoes. Then those slips will be transplanted onto the field bed. And after that, the sweet potato will grow. And once they've reached maturity, the growers will go and harvest those by digging them out of the ground to expose them using either a disc plow or a chain digger. These are different alternatives, but there's some advantages and disadvantages to each one of them. But those are the alternatives. And then once they've dug them up to expose them, they will send in a crew of harvesters equipped with buckets and tools to collect those sweet potatoes. And those harvesters, once they have harvested the sweet potatoes, then at that point in time, there are two types of sweet potatoes that emerge. There is one quantity of sweet potatoes that actually was harvested and will be sold to the market. And then there's another quantity of sweet potato that is inadvertently left in the field. And that's quantity of sweet potato, that's really where our interest is. From those sweet potatoes, growers have revealed that most of them really just do nothing, at which point in time that sweet potato will either just become post-harvest loss. Some of them do call some volunteers to glean the field so that, for donations and things like that. And on some occasions, some growers have also used some researchers to sample the field and come up with an estimation of how much was actually left in the field, which is what I'm referring to as the direct observation measurement of sweet potato left in the field. And the idea was to see if there is enough sweet potatoes left so we could go back in the field and reharvest that sweet potato and sell them for profits. The alternative that is being proposed in this study is using a drone or an unmanned aerial vehicle to quantify the sweet potatoes left in the field and then determine if the quantity is large enough to go back and harvest it and then sell it. So really the scenario are looking at the operating cost of using the drone and then adding to that the cost of reharvesting the field if necessary, and then looking at the benefit that could be generated from selling what was recovered if all of that was actually sold. Same thing, we're comparing this scenario to the direct observation from a field technician or researcher, where we're really just trying to see if we could send in a field technician, observe the fields, and then come up with an idea of how much was left in the field so that we could then see if it's worth going back in the field to reharvest and sell those sweet potatoes. So in order to do this, what we did was we collected a lot of data first. So the first set of data we looked at was really just looking at the measurement hours for both scenarios. So we're looking here at the drone alternative, which is a Matrix 600 Pro equipped with 2 cameras, one with an RGB sensor and another one with an NIR filter, so that the drone could capture different quality of images and then quantify post-harvest loss. Sweet potatoes left in the field from there. And the other alternative is using the field technician who will go in the field, sample, take a few measurements, and then come up with an idea of how much was left. So there's some activities of, in each scenario that are required to quantify sweet potatoes, and there's a number of hours that is also established for those activities. The second set of data we collected were the harvesting hours. So in case the grower is going to send a harvester to capture all of recover the sweet potatoes that were left, how many hours does it take for that harvester to actually recover the sweet potatoes? The third data set we collected was the quantity of sweet potato left in the field, because if we're going to try and quantify the benefits of the sweet potatoes left in the field, then we need to know how much is left, typically how much is left, so that we can compare that to the cost of quantifying those sweet potatoes. So these information were obtained from the literature, but also from some of the people that we working with on this project. And then the fourth data set was really just looking at the hourly fees for the drone pilots, because if they're going to survey that field, they're going to charge a certain fee. Also, the field technicians for taking the direct measurements, but also the fees for the harvester, because they are going to, if there is a need to send them back in the field and harvest. And then the last part was the selling price of the sweet potatoes, because this is how we're actually going to calculate the benefits from the sweet potatoes recovered. And so with all of this information, what we did was looking at the drone versus the field technician scenario. And we had a measurement cost. That was the first thing that we calculated, a measurement cost in each scenario. And then from that measurement cost, we conducted a sensitivity analysis to see how the change in the input affects those measurement costs. And then we also looked at the reharvesting cost. Now, reharvesting cost doesn't really vary as a function of whether we're using the drone or a field technician. It's just reharvesting. And then we have a measurement cost plus reharvesting cost. So in case the grower says, okay, we've measured, we know that we have to go back and recover the sweet potato. So what's the cost of those two components? And then the last thing we looked at was the net benefits. Again, still for those two alternatives. And from the net benefit, we also did a sensitivity analysis. So, those are the calculation behind the decision support tool. The user interface itself, again, we use the R-Shiny package of R to build it. And what you see here is really just directly coming from the data I just presented, right? So when you open this decision support tool, you are able to define the measurements alternative that you want to use. And so in this case, we already got some data. So what we used was that drone that I talked about earlier on. And then you can see the data that we have for each scenario. The second thing was, the harvester, same thing. This is exactly the data that I showed earlier on, but just put into the interface. So by default, you can have this, but then the user can also change these numbers if they want to. And then the third part is really just the quantity of sweet potatoes that is typically recovered from the literature. And once we had all of that information, we were then able to start looking at the costs and the benefits. I will talk about these graphs shortly in a little more detail. But what we're also able to do is define the price of the hourly fee for the drone pilots, the hourly fee for the harvester, the technician, and also the selling price, the sweet potato selling prices. And so looking a little bit closer to these results, what we are looking here is the comparison in measurement cost between using a field technician and using a drone. And this measurement is done over 10 fields. So we're starting with 1 field all the way to 10 fields. And one main observation we see here is that the cost of using the drone, over here is, when you're only looking at 1 field, is about 27 times less than the cost of using a field technician. But as the number of fields increase, the cost, that difference gets larger, right? Meaning that as the number of fields increase, it becomes more economical to use a drone. So that's one observation. The second observation is, let's say that after quantifying the sweet potatoes left in the field, the grower decides not to harvest. At that point in time, the sunk cost of just using the drone and not harvesting is really relatively less and insignificant in comparison to using the field technician. So in both cases, whether we're going to harvest or not harvest, it's really quite cheaper to use the drone. Then if we're going to add the cost of harvesting to these alternatives, what we see is that the drone is still much cheaper than using the field technician, but the difference between those two options becomes a little bit smaller. Oh my God. I'm not sure what is happening. I'm supposed to have a sensitivity analysis chart here. But we talk about the net benefits. Yeah, I might have to go out to just. Okay, so this is the sensitivity analysis based on the cost of operating the drone without looking at an additional cost of harvesting. And what we see here is that we're looking at the change in different inputs that I showed all the data that are collected and how that affects the baseline, which is really just the cost of quantifying sweet potatoes using the drone over one field. And so by doing that, we see that there's the cost is mainly driven by the pilot's hourly fee. And so, well, that's what the sensitivity analysis tells us in terms of the cost of quantifying sweet potatoes using the drone. And then the sensitivity analysis in terms of the field technician is really the cost is driven by the difference between the number of data points that the drone collects versus the number of data points that the field technician collects. So if the field technician, we have to collect a lot of data in order to get the same number of data that the drone can collect. In this case, we had a drone that was collecting 120 data points versus a field technician collecting 3 data points per field. And so if the drone, the field technician collects more data, and that as the data points get closer to the drone, then it becomes more expensive because they have to work more hours. So, and then looking at the benefits, what we see here is, again, in both cases, if we're going to quantify sweet potatoes left in the field, then reharvest it, and then sell those sweet potatoes, it doesn't really matter which option we're using. In both cases, we do have a positive net benefit value. But the difference is not that much, which means that we should look at more additional benefit from using the drones, not just looking at the benefit from quantifying sweet potatoes left in the field. And looking again at the sensitivity analysis here, what we realize is that the number of, or the quantity of sweet potatoes that is recovered, and particularly the grades 1, so now US number 1, and the selling price of those sweet potatoes are the factors that drive the sensitivity or the price of the net benefit. And so to conclude this chapter, the field technician, as I showed earlier on, the difference between using a field technician and using a drone to quantify sweet potatoes left in the field for just one field is about 27 times. So it's 27 times more expensive to use a field technician if we're only looking at one field of 13 acres. If we're going to look at 10 fields of 13 acres, the difference gets even larger. It becomes 67 times. As the number of fields increases, it becomes more economical to use the drone. And as I mentioned earlier on, even if you're not going to reharvest the field, using the drone, that cost incurred from just using the drone is relatively lower compared to the field technician. And the benefit from, generated from the sweet potato recovered after they were quantified using the drone is not that much different from the benefit from using the field technician. And so it might be important to look at additional benefits from using the drone to make it even more beneficial. So deliverable of this study, what we had was, we have one completed manuscript, which hopefully will be submitted again this month for publication. There's also a web-based decision support tool that was created as a result of this study, which again, accessible through any device with a good internet connection. So the overall conclusions, what we see from the first case study is that the technologies that could help reduce food loss and make value chains more food secure do exist. But the problem is there's a very limited adoption. And in the case of the Yield-Wise initiative and many other initiatives that have attempted to help farmers adopt technologies, post-harvest loss tends to be the main criteria. If not, then it's always still based on singular criteria. It might be a technical criteria, whereas we think that it might be important to assess technologies based on multiple criteria, not just one criteria. The focus when trying to increase adoption of post-harvest technologies should not be on the smallholder farmers alone, because value chains are made up of multiple value chain actors. Increasing the adoption of improved technologies, good agricultural practices are predicted to have an impact on post-harvest loss. Calculating a composite utility value is a more reliable way of assessing technologies or ranking them. And then the adoption of post-harvest technologies or the preferences of what is a good measure of a technology varies from one value chain actor to another. So in some value chains, if there are differences between the preferences of one value chain actor and of multiple value chain actors, then it becomes very difficult to determine what technology is the best for to be promoted. And so in terms of the just quickly gonna go back to my previous slide. Well, in terms of the second case study, looking at the sweet potato project, what we realize is that using the drone is certainly cheaper than sending in a field technician to quantify the sweet potatoes that is left in the field. And, but it might be important to also look at additional ways of generating benefit from using the drone, such as quantifying or predicting yield, for example, looking at the health of the plant and many other actions that could result into benefits. So future works, what could be done with regard to the multi-attribute utility theory decision support tool is allow the user to also input the weight and the preference of the value chain actors, because right now the decision support tool doesn't allow for that, but I think by the time the manuscript is published, it will have that functionality. But also perhaps try to add more criteria, because we only have 6 criteria, but we might also add a few more there, or at least allow the user to add those criteria. As far as the techno-economic analysis is concerned, as I mentioned earlier, we might need to look at quantifying the data collected from the drones. into perhaps monetary values, or looking at other benefits that we can gain from quantifying the data using the drone. So with that, I would like to acknowledge and thank the Rockefeller Foundation for funding this research, and the Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research. Also want to thank my committee here, my major professor, Dr. Meyer, and everyone here sitting, listening to this presentation, as well as the people joining online. Thank you very much.
So Hory, we'll keep the webinar recording on.
Right.
And so if you want to open the chat function, there's one question in there that you can get to. Otherwise, I'll read it to you.
Okay.
But the thing is, you'll have to somehow repeat it or capture it, right? So, so the question is, in sub-Saharan Africa, adoption of technology is indeed a major challenge based on multifaceted issues like cost, attitude of adopters, and sometimes policy directions. Would like to know what was key in your study that contributed to the limited adoption of technologies in your case study, specifically with regard to mango and tomatoes. Just kind of rephrase the question and answer it because it's
okay. So the, would you like me to rephrase the question? All right. So, well, I'll just take the last part of it. So in my case, what was the contributed to the limited adoption of post-harvest technologies in my study? The thing is, I did not so much focus on the adoption per se, as I did on how do we actually promote technologies for increased adoption. So the idea here is to say, you know, if we do have an effective way of promoting technologies, then that will result into increased adoption. And as a result of that, reduce post-harvest loss. So I would simply say that the limited adoption is, you know, the study that I've done is really trying to answer that question. How do we increase adoption, but using more of a, you know, effective promotion approach. Yeah.
Questions here in the room.
I'll start there. So as like drone technology continues to improve, how and like those technologies tend to get cheaper, how will that affect the way you analyze the sweet potato value chain as like new functions that drones can do with computer vision, or they get cheaper, or they're more accessible? How will that change your analysis?
Again, please state the question.
Okay, so as the drones are being used more often and have more functionalities, how will that affect my study, my analysis? I think one thing that's, you know, I probably should have mentioned earlier is that I focused on the techno-economic side of things in this project. There are some people that are working on more the, you know, collecting the data and processing those imagery, the data imagery and so on. And so I think that one challenge I've seen with them doing that was not the part that I did, was that, you know, it sometimes takes a little bit of time to get data. It also takes a tremendous amount of time to process that data. And so I see, you know, better drones becoming of really good help when it comes to processing the data, acquiring the data, and processing the data. In terms of the techno-economic analysis, I think that perhaps being able to you know, use a drone that could fly a little bit at a higher speed and collect data might reduce the amount of time that is required for the pilots to quantify the sweet potatoes. And by doing that, it will reduce the cost. So that's from the techno-economic perspective. So I think that's what I'm thinking. Yeah. Right.
I would like to say I really enjoyed it. But my question is, looking at all the work that you've done, how do you think this can be promoted to these project managers or people, the experts, and how is this going to be promoted so that they use it? And that could also be a way of evaluating what you've done and see the impact.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So when I started working on this project, the YieldWise initiative was kind of ending. So I was lucky enough to interact with some of these projects, program managers. And so, and I gathered that they wanted a tool like that, something that could help them make better decisions. And so the results that I have here, the decision support tool, is kind of answering those questions that I had from interacting with those program managers. But now there is still that last bit of saying, let's go back there and test it and see if it really answers those questions. It's really just a question of getting in contact with them and testing the technology and then seeing if it answers the questions as they wanted it. Yeah.
Hory, for the sweet potato project, for the data you have, did you consider not doing any analysis at all and then just always doing a second harvest?
Can you repeat that question, please?
So you were looking at, after the first harvest, you would take data by a person and by a drone.
Right.
And of course, that's a costly proposition.
Right.
So how would your total profit be if you didn't do any analysis, you just always did a second harvest?
Well, we did not analyze that. That's a good question. We did not analyze that, but the reason why we wanted to quantify the sweet potatoes first was so that we could see if we actually need to send in people to harvest the field or not do that.
But that's a costly decision.
Yes. Yeah, but it is a little bit cheaper using the drone. That's at least what we've gathered. But it would be nice to know that. I think that's something that I could always follow up with the people working in the team and see what we really just did. We did not focus on that side because the projects wanted to look at, we use the drone, do we go back in the field to reharvest the sweet potatoes or don't we do that? So, but, yeah.
Thanks for the presentation. So for the sweet potato, well, I have
all right, good.
For the sweet potato aspect, I saw that as part of the analysis, harvest,
right,
part of the cost in addition to that, the drone set, data scientists going.
Right.
Will that harvesting component change as you?
What component of the harvesting? The time, the cost, or?
The total part. I mean, the second part. So first, the harvest, some is left in the field.
Right.
You have an option to either use the drone or use the
right.
and depending on the cost component of these two options.
Right.
Harvesting cost.
Mm-hmm. So
my question is, if you don't consider any of these data scientists or field services
mm-hmm.
as part of trying to get an information on what is left,
mm-hmm.
with the second harvesting component, the cost component change based on the decision?
I think if I'm understanding correctly, that question is very similar to what Dr. Byrne just asked me. And at that point in time, the cost that we're looking at will be the cost incurred from harvesting the field. And then just and then we're going to look at the benefit that is generated from selling those sweet potatoes. And so, yes, there will be a little bit of change to the extent that the cost of quantifying the sweet potatoes will not be included. But that only makes a difference if we are looking at that option of using the field technician. Because if we're using the field technician, that the cost of quantifying the sweet potatoes might be really, really high. But if we're looking at just using the drone, then yes, there will be a difference, but it's not going to be much of a difference because using the drone really just results in a very small, cost for quantifying the sweet potatoes. Right.
The second question.
Right.
As an investor going back to Africa, which of these the value chain that's when you are engaged to it.
Right.
Which technology would you advise me to
Well, that's a good question. The technology that I would tell you to invest in is the technology that you know that there is a supply chain that is established for that technology. So it should be a technology that people can manufacture locally. It should be a technology that policymakers encourage to use. It should be a technology that you find value in, and it should be a technology that the buyers of your crop also find value in. So I think that will be a more sustainable way of adopting a technology if it meets all of those criteria. But if you want me to tell you exactly which technology, we know that when it comes to the mango value chain, the fruit fly traps were really good at preventing insect infestation before harvest and during harvest. We know that using plastic crates for transportations result into much better quality of mango. We know that using cold storage to preserve the mango result into better quality. If you're looking at the maize value chain, they had a number of technologies used there. One technology that was promoted by the Yieldwise Initiative, which showed to be really effective at reducing post-harvest loss, was the PICS hermetic bags, which is why I have a picture of that here in my slide. Yeah, so these at least are from the Yieldwise Initiative, but generally speaking, that's the answer I mentioned earlier.
Any other questions? So sort of a final question. There's nothing in the chat except lots of congratulatory notes. So I'll let you know that. Yeah, and the question that George asked kind of points towards this already, right? It seems like we kind of know the technology, we kind of know the practices, and your study sort of just highlighted again that a lot of it is really already available, right? Mm-hmm. It's sort of this question between adoption and promotion, and you even were asking about that in terms of the title of the dissertation, right? So, so sort of as an overall perspective, you spent the last 4 years working on this project. Was it worth it? You think that you have a much better sense with regard to the challenges of post-harvest loss, and if you were asked to advise people and the tools that you have developed and so forth, you feel like you would be able to recommend those and you would be able to consult on those and help people think about these things, or is there a whole lot more left that we haven't done yet?
So no, definitely. I think it was worth it. The reason why I'm saying it was worth it, this is not just a challenge that I could see from the Yieldwise Initiative. This is a challenge that I myself face as an entrepreneur back in Africa. I do deal a lot with smallholder farmers, and this is a serious issue of adopting technologies that will help them have better harvest, better product. And so I think that the approach that I have here is something that should be encouraged. certainly there are ways to improve these decision support tools. There are ways to make them also design them in a way that other value chain actors could also use them, not just the program managers and so on. But I think it really was worth it. The approach that we are suggesting in terms of using multiple criteria, in terms of looking at the entire value chain, this is really important because we've seen so many projects or programs aimed at helping farmers, bringing in all the technologies, sometimes even subsidizing technologies. The farmers will adopt them, and then once the subsidy is over, they won't be using them anymore. So I think there has to be an approach that really looks at creating those value chain or supply chains for the technologies and understanding what is the preference of all the value chain actors, I think so. Yeah.
Good. So since you've been active in hosting and organizing these webinars,
right?
Close this one out.
Sure. Okay. For some reason, I can't see much of.
You just need to make a few comments. That's it. Any closing comments?
Any closing comments? Well, I would say, I just want to thank everyone for being here today. I think this was this 4 years working on this project has been a great opportunity for me to learn and to grow, both as a researcher, but also just as a person. And so I want to thank everyone who has been part of that journey. And yep, I think that's pretty much it. Yeah.
Graduate students better get after that food.
Yeah. So we're going to 5 minutes break, and then
I don't know what happened to my slides, man.